when on Friday the Supreme Court ruled against his use of the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose tariffs, US President Donald Trump reacted furiously. Not only did he accuse the judges of being embarrassments to their families and swayed by foreign interests, he also made it clear that he wouldn't let the ruling get in the way of his wider tariff agenda, announcing just hours later that he would be using Section 122 of the 1974 Trade Act, a provision that has never been used before, to implement a universal tariff on all imports coming into the US, originally set at 10% but then apparently raised to 15% a day later. So in this video, we thought we'd take a look at these new tariffs and explain why, as well as undermining a whole load of Trump's recent trade agreements, they might also be illegal. Trump was the world's most influential person on our recent ranking. So in the latest edition of our magazine Too Long, we explain how he retained his top place position, and why that strong result might actually be based on increasingly shaky foundations, as he grapples with unpopularity and divisions within his base. That's just one of 72 pages in the magazine, because as always, there's more to Too Long than you'd expect. Purchase your copy by clicking the link in the description. So let's get straight into it. Section 122 basically permits the president to impose a universal tariff of up to 15% for up to 150 days, at which point their extension requires congressional approval, whenever, quote, fundamental international payment problems require special import measures to restrict imports. Specifically, the legislation identifies 3 instances where such import measures might be required: to deal with large and serious United States balance of payments deficits, to prevent an imminent and significant depreciation of the dollar in foreign exchange markets, or to cooperate with other countries in correcting an international balance of payments disequilibrium. In recent press releases, Trump's White House has made it very clear that this new 15% tariff is intended to deal with the first instance. In other words, to address large and serious balance of payments deficits. This is what the White House referenced in their first so-called proclamation announcing the original 10% tariff on Saturday, and again in the accompanying fact sheet published a few hours after. Now, at first glance, this might sound pretty reasonable. After all, it's true that the US does indeed have a large and persistent trade deficit. In other words, the US imports a lot more stuff than it exports. Relatedly, the US also has a large and persistent current account deficit, which is basically the trade deficit plus net income from foreign overseas investments and unilateral transfers from stuff like remittances and foreign aid. This sounds quite a lot like a balance of payments deficit, and the White House seems to use all 3 terms nearly interchangeably in its recent proclamation. But this is, at least as we understand it, wrong. While they might sound similar, trade deficits and balance of payments deficits are not the same thing. In fact, while the term isn't really used that much anymore, the balance of payments is generally understood as the difference between the current account and the so-called capital account, which basically measures all the money flowing in or out of a country. This means that, for countries that run current account deficits, a balance of payment deficit would only occur when the capital account surplus is smaller than the current account deficit. In other words, when there's not enough money flowing into the US to afford its excess imports. However, in the vast majority of modern economies, running a meaningful balance of payment deficit is essentially impossible because of floating exchange rates. Just think about it for a second. If there's not enough money flowing into the US, floating exchange rates mean the value of the dollar will fall against other currencies. Americans won't be able to import as much stuff, and the current account deficit will shrink. This is why, at least according to the vast majority of economists, in modern economies with floating exchange rates, the trade and capital accounts necessarily balance. This speaks to an oft underappreciated fact about the US trade deficit. The US can only afford to run persistent and large current account deficits because foreigners pour billions of dollars worth of their own currencies into the US every year, creating a massive capital account surplus. Every time a foreign bank buys a US Treasury, or one of our non-American viewers buys shares in the S&P 500, foreign cash flows into the US, which is then used to finance the trade deficit. Anyway, you get the point. In modern economies like the US, it's essentially impossible to run a balance of trade deficit. This raises the question, What is the 1974 Trade Act even talking about when it makes reference to large and serious balance of payments deficits? Well, the simple answer is that, at the time, the US didn't really have a floating exchange rate. Until 1971, the dollar was fixed to gold at an exchange rate of $35 per ounce, and all the world's other major currencies were pegged to the dollar at fixed exchange rates, although these could be adjusted with IMF approval. Under these conditions, balance of payment deficits were possible, and the affected country would have to cover the difference between its current and capital accounts by dipping into its reserves. In the Bretton Woods system, this essentially meant burning through your dollar reserves, which, due to the fact that the dollar was pegged to gold, was de facto the same as burning through your gold reserves. When the US started running large balance of payment deficits in the late 60s and early 70s, this obviously caused some anxiety in Washington, because, well, they didn't want to run out of gold. This is perhaps the main reason why, in 1971, then President Richard Nixon gave up on the gold peg, and by 1973, a year before the 1974 Trade Act, the Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate system had fallen apart. However, the world didn't just immediately move to the sort of pure floating system we have today. Rather, the vast majority of central banks continued to intervene in the market in an attempt to at least stabilise their exchange rates. And it was in this context that Congress passed the 1974 Trade Act. They'd been worried for years about essentially running out of gold, and even if the US was no longer formally in a fixed exchange rate system, policymakers at the time were still worried about balancing reserve depletion against currency stability. But this isn't a problem for the US today at all. The dollar might be going down a bit sometimes, but the idea that the US could effectively run out of gold in the way it might have done in the 1970s just doesn't really make sense. If less money comes into the US, the dollar gets a bit weaker, and the trade deficit shrinks. It's hardly a crisis. The administration could alternatively argue that it needs these new universal tariffs for one of the other two reasons, but this also feels like a long shot. Similarly, the dollar can't really suffer the sort of imminent and significant depreciation Congress imagined in 1974 in a floating exchange rate system like we have today. And, well, Trump clearly isn't cooperating with other countries in any meaningful sense here. Now, it's of course possible that the Supreme Court disagrees with us, and ultimately rules in Trump's favour here. But the mere fact that these new tariffs might plausibly be illegal adds yet more uncertainty to both the American and global economies, at a time when it's really not needed. As we mentioned earlier, the latest edition of our magazine Too Long is out very soon. And if you subscribe using code SPRING26, then you'll get your first copy for as little as £4.99, as well as 20% off every future issue as long as you stay subscribed. The latest issue features our ranking of the world's 25 most influential people, using ratings from you, our audience, as well as from our journalists. Inside, we not only reveal the full ranking, but the stories of a number of people who made the list, from the return of Donald Trump and the calculated moves of Xi Jinping to the AI frontiers of Sam Altman. We look at the new entries, New York's first Muslim mayor Zohran Mamdani, the radical shift of Pope Leo XIV, and bastion of technocracy Mark Carney, as well as the shadows that still linger, like Jeffrey Epstein. Across 72 pages, this issue of Too Long features a whole lot more than just that. We also have a cover story on how the UK became more divided than ever, and how a broken country could rebuild, the fragmentation emerging within the EU, how religion is being hijacked by politicians, as well as much, much more. You can pre-order your copy at toolong.news, and remember to use code SPRING26 for the best ever price.